Lecture, the Roman army. And I thought I'd begin by explaining that the Roman army has been probably my principal research interest, my principal interest here since I was probably about 10 years old. I subsequently, as a student, wrote my second year extended essay on the Roman army. My undergraduate dissertation in third year for my degree was also on an aspect of the Roman army. Then I wrote my doctorate on the Roman army. All of my earliest publications were on the Roman army. I've moved on, I've sort of grown up since then, and I do other things apart from playing with toy soldiers. But still, it's remained a significant interest of mine ever since I was about 10 years old. And I thought I'd begin by just explaining what that meant in practice. You'll immediately recognize a map of Britain, and the little red circle there, which I hope has come up behind. Yes, it has. The little red circle there is where I come from on the east coast of Scotland. Now, you'll immediately realise this is outside the Roman Empire. The Roman frontier is in about here, between the Solway and the Tyne. So this is well outside the Roman frontier. It's even outside the Antonine Wall, which runs across between roughly Glasgow and Edinburgh. However, as a 10-year-old at school, we were told as part of our history of Scotland that the Romans had campaigned in this area, even this area beyond the frontier. Roman armies of 10, 15, 30,000 men had marched up through this area. We were told that the Roman army was very sophisticated by the standards of antiquity, indeed by the standards of just about any army through until relatively recent times, namely that it marched a regular distance every day, about 20 Roman miles every day. At the end of the day, they would stop and they would devote anything up to 2, 3, or 4 hours digging a camp for themselves, digging a ditch, not just a ditch of any form, but their engineers would actually lay out a large rectangular shape. They would dig a ditch, the material from the ditch would be used to create an internal embankment, and then the soldiers each had 2 wooden stakes that they would plant on the top of the embankment as a sort of rudimentary palisade. And then inside the camp they would lay out their tents in an orderly fashion. They would have areas in which the horses were kept, areas in which the commanding officer's tent would be pitched so that everybody knew exactly how to find them, and where the tent for the headquarters staff would be. It was all very orderly and really unique. No other ancient army behaved like this, and indeed right through until relatively recent times no army behaved like this. So to be told this when you're 10 years old, that Roman armies behaving like this had marched through the area where you had been brought up, and that you could see from looking at maps of the area that right near where you were living in the neighbouring farm there was a field that had a little cross in it saying Roman camp site of. That's really quite exciting to think that in a field that you could go to, 10 or 15 minutes walk from where you're living, an army of tens of thousands of men at some stage had camped there for the night or 2 nights before moving on. All of these dots represent Roman military camps, these temporary camps. And as you can see, it's a map for camps throughout Britain. There's about 600 in total, and as you can see, probably about 3/4 are in Scotland. Most Roman campaigning took place up there, but it's also where the evidence survives best. And you can see that in this area where I was brought up, there are a lot of these camps. Roman armies marching up, you can see that they're following a natural route there, so there's a whole concentration of camps. And then when they get up to where the highlands begin here, they're deflected northeastwards along the fringe of the highlands towards this narrow coastal plain that would take them round onto the rather larger coastal plain to the northwest of Aberdeen. So they're coming precisely through this area where I was brought up. Lots of camps in that area, various sizes. The bigger dot represents several camps, 4 or more, in a single location. The smaller dots are just 1 or 2 camps. But there's a lot of them, as you can see. What you actually see when you go to places like that, where there's a map with a little cross on it saying Roman camp site of, is that basically there's nothing to be seen today. There's a Roman camp in here, in this field, and you can see the highlands in the background. Armies marching up this way would then be deflected along the highlands. As far as we know, they never penetrated the highlands. They simply circle round them. There's a camp in that field there, nothing to be seen today at ground level. Just bear in mind those houses down there, because we're going to look at it in an aerial view now. there it is. That photograph was taken from about there, looking this way towards those houses. There's the houses there, and as you can see, there's a large Roman camp there, one of these great rectangular camps. You always spot the Roman ones, straight lines. The corners aren't at a sharp angle, but they're rounded, so it's like a playing card, so you often refer to the playing card shape of Roman forts. And they've got these very distinctive gateways. There's one there, it's called a clavicular entrance. A gate is always the weakest point of any fortification here, so they went to some trouble to develop ways of strengthening them. But you can see that there's a large camp there, not traceable in the grass field over there to the east, but in this field that's got crops in it, shows up quite clearly. Roman armies were there later as well. Here's a more permanent fort, the ditches of one there, and here's a large Roman fort there with double ditches. But it's the temporary camp that is what I'm principally concerned with here at the moment. So if you're a 10-year-old, the idea of this sort of thing, you're not, even though you can't see anything in the field except the cows, is still very exciting, and it explains why 50-odd years later I'm standing here telling you about the Roman army. Moving on to try and put in context the period that I'm going to be looking at. First of all, I'm not going to be telling you about the Roman army from beginning to end. Roman history begins, according to Roman legend, in 753 BC. It probably began a bit before that, but at some stage they alighted on that year as the precise year in which their little village of Rome on the Tiber was founded. This continuous Roman history as a political entity from 753 BC onwards, right through until the final extinguishing of the last bit of the Roman Empire in AD 1453. So just 40 years before Columbus is discovering the New World, there was still a fragment of the Roman Empire surviving in the shape of Constantinople and a little bit of territory around about it. But in that year, the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople. The last Roman emperor, Constantine IX, is killed fighting, and the Roman Empire finally comes to an end after, well, you do the math, 2,200 odd years. That means that the last Roman emperors, 600 years away from us, but that last Roman emperor could look back 2,200 years to the beginning of the state of which he was the last representative. It's a really remarkable achievement here to have this political entity continuing for 2,200 years. So I'm not going to tell you about the Roman army throughout this period, because inevitably it changes quite dramatically as the state evolves from a little town on the Tiber right the way through to the height of the Roman Empire and then to its final extinguishing in what is essentially the Middle Ages. The core period for most people studying Roman history is the early Imperial period, which extends from about 30 BC through to AD 284, and that's what I'm going to be looking at in the two lectures today. Just to put that in a context of where that fits with Greek history, here's a little table to illustrate what's happening in the Greek and Roman worlds with the dates down the middle. You know, so Greece, the Middle Bronze Age, and the palace civilizations of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans in Greece, the beginning of writing and so on, the Greek Dark Ages, and then you get the revival of civilization in the Greek world soon after 800 BC, and it's at this point that the foundation of the settlement of Rome occurs. That's then followed by about 2.5 centuries of what we call the regal period in Roman history, 7 kings of Rome, according to Roman legend, presiding over this little state that's developing on the Tiber, growing from a village to a town to something rather larger as they fight their neighbours and gradually absorb their territory. But we've got about 2.5 centuries of the regal period. That then gives way to something really very remarkable for any period in history, namely the Roman Republic. Various states had created republics, but they normally didn't last very long. The Roman Republic, as you can see, lasts for almost 500 years, 5 centuries. An astonishing achievement. And during that period, it goes from being a small state on the Tiber to being a Mediterranean-wide empire. Yeah, truly sort of, in modern terms, we talk about it as being a global power. And at the ending of the Roman Republic is one of those salutary lessons for us all in all times, the way in which even the most stable of states can get into trouble, in this case what's called the Roman Revolution, the last 100 years of the Roman Republic, and the eventual demise of this republic and its replacement by an autocracy, a state ruled over by people we call emperors, beginning with the Emperor Augustus and continuing right through to Constantine IX in 1453. So the change from a republic to various phases of the Roman Empire, the early empire, the bit we're going to be dealing with today, right there. And it's the army of this period when the Roman Empire is at its height that I'm going to be concerned with. No prizes for guessing what this is. It's a German Shepherd with Russell Crowe on the horse. You get a rather nice depiction of a Roman army there. I mean, if you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, it's worth watching simply to give you sort of half shut your eyes, which you have to do it sometimes anyway. It gives you a rather nice impression of what a Roman army was like, what warfare in the period was like, the sort of semi-chaos of it all. The reliability of what you actually see in the picture. A professor of classics at Yale was asked to look at the script before they made the movie. She gave them she said a 350-page critique of it. You know, the number of errors in it was appalling, but since they'd only said that they wanted to consult what she said, they paid no attention to any of it and went ahead with the movie exactly as they planned it. However, one of my first students when I was teaching at Sheffield, almost 40 years ago now, went on to do his doctorate on the Roman army. He's written a whole series of books since then, and he's always furious when he sees any movie like this because they get everything wrong. In particular, he will look at things like that and say, that kind of helmet didn't come into use until 23 years later. This is outrageous. For most of us, it doesn't matter. It looks pretty good. I can't tell whether that's the Imperial Gallic 3 or the Imperial Gallic 4A helmet that man's wearing, and most of the time I really don't care very much. But it gives you a wonderful impression of what a Roman army looked like, and in particular the uniformity of Roman forces. Soldiers equipped in the same way, organized in the same way. With the Legionaries on the left here, with all the same kind of heavy military equipment, and on the other side here we've got archers wearing chainmail, conical helmets, and there's their bows. Archers of a type we know were, this is how the archers from what's today Syria were equipped. The Roman army is usually regarded as one of the most successful armies at any period in history. Why is that? Why was it so successful? Why is this little state that begins on the Tiber simply as one small village amongst many in a peninsula that's fragmented between all sorts of states, including very powerful ones like the Etruscans further north and the Greek states in the south, the hill peoples of the Samnites and so on in the mountains to the east of them? Why was it that Rome was the one that came to dominate all of Italy and then to dominate the whole of the Mediterranean, and to do so for several centuries, and to do so very successfully? Part of the explanation, of course, is the success of their army. It's partly a matter of morale. When we read Roman accounts of their own wars, they have this tremendous self-belief. They know that they're going to win ultimately, that they know that they will lose battles, and they lose lots of them, sometimes catastrophically, but they know that they'll bounce back from it and ultimately they'll win. Part of the reason is they believe that the gods favour them. This is a pagan period in Roman history. As far as they were concerned, the gods favoured them, and therefore everything would turn out. So there's this conviction of the sort of rightness of what they're doing as well. It's all been foreordained that they're going to be a Mediterranean-wide empire. Partly they reinforce it by inventing legends and myths about their past, to tell one another that it's all being foreordained. They have military advantages. They have tremendously poor generalship. We shouldn't be fooled by knowing of people like Julius Caesar, who's one of these people who's sort of unexpectedly thrown up, turns out to be a military genius. He's had no training for it whatsoever, but he turns out to have just the right touch for it and is a military genius. There are a few other Roman generals like that, but by and large Roman generals had no experience, they had no training for the job, and they frequently led their armies into terrible disasters. It's a bit like early British history. They've got a manpower advantage as well. Italy is a fairly densely populated landscape, so that they, even despite having catastrophic losses in war, they were able to then rebuild their armies afterwards. Above all, they're better organized, as the sort of thing that I was alluding to when I was talking about these camps. That's something that set them apart from their neighbors. And they've got a very systematic, very professional, very modern approach to how they went about doing things in war. The camps is just one aspect of that. Most ancient armies simply sat down at night when they'd finished, and they would be chaotic, and they were often very vulnerable to being attacked. They made no provision for hygiene, for example, something I'll come back to in the second of the lectures today. So that if you suddenly set down 10, 20, 30,000 people on the spot, very soon they're polluted where they are, and disease breaks out. The Romans knew about that, and they took steps to minimize the danger. But above all, one of the things that's regarded as a feature of Roman armies that gives them the advantage over their neighbours is that they had an officer class, something that most ancient armies didn't have. They deliberately inculcated the idea of junior officers and the I'll come back to it later. The duplicari and the centurions are the sort of backbone of the Roman army. They're professional soldiers with years of training behind them, and they give the army an advantage in warfare that most of the people they're fighting against simply don't have. There's a war ethos at Rome as well. Most ancient states fought wars regularly, but what's striking about Rome is that they not only fought wars virtually every year against somebody, at least one of their neighbours, but they were proud of it as well. In Rome, the Temple of Janus had its doors open when the state was at war somewhere, either on land or at sea, during the course of that year. And the Romans themselves believed that between 753 and 31 BC, the period we're just about to begin on, the doors of the Temple of Janus were only closed twice during the course of over 700 years. And they were rather proud of the fact that they were fighting somebody virtually every year throughout that period. But it means, too, that even the people who were not the officers of the legions, the common soldiers, were people who got a lot of military experience that their neighbours in their armies didn't get. So that Rome is often referred to as the Prussia of the ancient world, a state that was highly militarized, its citizen body being expected to play their role in the army every year. A citizen's duty was to be prepared to be enrolled, conscripted for military service every year. Before I go on to talking about that, I'll just draw your attention to a few books. I've brought copies of them all down here if you want to have a look at them at the break. Until 20 years ago, the standard book was that by Graham Webster called The Roman Imperial Army, and you can see it went through at least 3 editions. That's really been replaced now by a rather younger scholar, Adrian Goldsworthy, who's written a whole swathe of books on different aspects of Roman history, particularly military history. So his book on the complete Roman army is probably the one, if you're looking for a single book, that's the one to turn to. At the same, alongside that, is the book by Lawrence Keppie, who was a contemporary of mine at Oxford 40 years ago, but who went on to also write about Roman military affairs. He too brought up with Roman military camps around him in Glasgow, so probably we had the same sort of experience in our childhood. And then there's Adrian Goldsworthy's most recent book, just came out a few months ago, if I remember right, called Pax Romana, War, Peace and Conquest in the Roman World. And just to finish, there's a couple on the frontiers of the Roman Empire. In the period we're dealing with, most Roman armies were not engaged in warfare on an everyday basis. They were engaged in maintaining the frontiers. So that books on the frontiers of the Roman Empire have become extremely common in recent years. I've just put up 2 here, that by David Breeze, and this one published in Germany, one of 2 books with this almost identical title published in Germany last year. I've singled out books in English. At home I've got equivalent of 2 shelves full of books on the Roman army, and I stopped buying books on the army a long time ago. Almost all of those are the ones in English. There are probably about 10 to 20 books on some aspect of the Roman army come out every year, and there will be 200 or 300 articles on various aspects of the Roman army every year. I don't think I would be capable of keeping up with that if I did nothing else. If I spent all my waking hours, I still couldn't keep up with the whole mass of material coming out in the Roman army every year in every language. I should, just before I move on, with David Breeze there, he's at the forefront at the moment of having the frontiers of the Roman Empire everywhere declared to be a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, starting with the ones in Europe where it's relatively easy to meet the criteria for being a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and working his way around to the Middle East, where, as you can imagine, in places like Syria, it's a bit tricky at the moment to get approval for that to be regarded as a World Heritage Site. You can't actually get access to the parts of it. turning to the army that the Emperor Augustus creates. And it is something that he creates that is quite different what had been there before. As I drew your attention to a moment ago, we've had 5 centuries of the Roman Republic. That then gives way after about 30 BC to the period we call the Empire. And for the sake of convenience, we'll talk about the Emperor Augustus. It's not what he called himself or what contemporaries called him, but the use of that title has become hallowed by tradition in modern times. Augustus is the first emperor. He has the job of consolidating the state and its army at the end of a long period of civil wars and 100 years, the Roman Revolution, of upheaval. So there have been a whole succession of civil wars. The one that he eventually wins comes to an end in 30 BC with the suicide of Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt, and at that point the civil wars end. Augustus is in complete control of the Roman Empire and all its armed forces, both the ones under his control and the ones that have now surrendered to him that had been part of Antony's army. During this period of the 100 years of the Roman Revolution, there had been a whole series of major external wars going on at the same time. So you've got this remarkable period during which, for the better part of 100 years, you've got catastrophic civil wars, a succession of them going on inside the Roman Empire, and at the same time they're fighting and extending the empire beyond the external frontiers. The Roman Empire probably doubles in size during that 100 years at a time when you would have thought that they were so focused on internal problems with their civil wars that nothing of the sort would happen. One consequence of all this is that there's a mass recruitment takes place during this time, not least by the people engaged in the civil wars. They want to have armies because the loser in an external war in the Roman world would simply not be employed again by the state. If your armies defeated in battle against the Germans or the Syrians or the Parthians or whatnot, you're simply not employed again. You lose a civil war battle and you're probably going to end up dead, and probably all your family as well. So all these people competing in the civil wars, they recruit the largest armies they can, and they're not particularly fussy where they get the manpower from. So in the period of the civil war, right down to Augustus, the Roman army is changing in character very dramatically in size and in the character of the forces. Until the civil wars begin, only Roman citizens served in Roman armies normally. You had to be a citizen, and indeed you had to be a citizen with a certain amount of property. You had to have enough property to be able to equip yourself. The state didn't provide your equipment, so if you were too poor to do that, you were really at the bottom of the economic heap in the Roman world. You couldn't serve in the army. You might be employed if there was a fleet needed to be a rower in the fleets. The fleets of the Roman Empire didn't have slaves rowing them. This is not Ben-Hur. It was Roman citizens who rowed the ships in their navy. But all citizens were expected to provide military service. It was an obligation that all citizens had when called upon, and as I said, almost every year they were being called upon to serve somewhere or other. Increasingly, however, particularly during the period of the civil wars, we find generals starting to make use of people who are not Roman citizens. Some of the subject peoples of their empire, some of the subject peoples of Sicily or the south of Gaul that's become a Roman province, or of Spain and so on. They start to turn a blind eye to the fact that these people are not citizens. Normally they should not be serving the Roman army, but they want their manpower, so they enroll them. During the course of the civil wars, hundreds of thousands of people, both Italian Roman citizens and provincials, are under arms, sometimes for years at a time. And the result is that it brings to an end these 400 or 500 years of the Roman army as a citizen militia, a citizen body in which everybody, all able-bodied adult males, were expected to be able to serve between the ages of 16 and 42. You could be called upon for service as often as the state required it, up to a maximum of 16 years in a lifetime. So that even though you were not a professional soldier, and these citizens are almost invariably simply peasant farmers, you could nevertheless spend 16 years of this core period of your adult life serving in the army because it was a requirement of being a citizen. So when Augustus finally acquires sole rule over the Roman Empire with the death of Antony and Cleopatra, he's got this huge military force that he has to organize or reorganize, and he's got to decide what to do with all the developments that have taken place during the previous 100 years. He's also got a huge empire to deal with. It's grown dramatically and haphazardly during the previous 100 years. He's got to work out ways of how he deals with that. to deal with the army and to deal with the empire simultaneously. It all has to be organised. What happens is that we get a transformation takes place. Instead of the tradition of the previous generations in which all able-bodied adult males had to perform short periods of service as a civic duty, in future, from within a few years of Augustus defeating Antony and Cleopatra, it becomes an army of volunteers, Roman citizens who volunteered to serve, but they will serve for a long period of time now, an agreed long period of service. So it is transformed from a citizen militia that's ostensibly sort of semi-amateur to a fully professional army of long-term volunteers. Augustus is able to establish a new style of army and to tinker with it until he gets it right as he sees it, because he reigns for 43 years after the death of Antony and Cleopatra, from 30 BC down to AD 14. It turns out that he's the longest lived of all Roman emperors, you're right the way through to Constantine IX in 1453. But it means that he has this enormous scope for doing all sorts of things and then correcting his mistakes and modifying and developing things over the course of this 40-odd years. And one of the things he's working with is the army that he's transforming from a civic militia to a professional army. He bequeaths an army to his successors, beginning with his stepson Tiberius in AD 14, which all his successors tinker with in various ways, and they increase its size. But if you were to fast forward to 284, and Augustus was able to look at the empire, the army of the empire in AD 284, 300 years after his own death, it would have been recognisably the army he'd created. It had been bigger, been different in some ways, but it had been recognisably the same army, just 300 years on. So it's a remarkable achievement on Augustus's part that he is able to create a force that was to remain in character essentially unchanged for 3 centuries. The sort of things that he does that are developments in this period and that were at variance with what had happened before. First of all, legions, which had traditionally only ever been recruited in Italy from Roman citizens, they start to recruit them in the provinces as well. Initially from people in the provinces who were Roman citizens there, who'd settled there, but increasingly also sort of turning a blind eye to the fact that somebody wasn't a Roman citizen, but if you needed recruits, and this was a volunteer, you didn't ask him to prove he was a Roman citizen. You would enroll him and give him citizenship so that he could perform his service. They're also able to make use of the children of Roman legionaries who'd settled in the provinces, who contracted marriages in the provinces and had children there who were not officially Roman citizens, but their father had spent a lifetime in the army, therefore the state was willing to overlook the fact that the children were not citizens and enroll them in the legions. So the character of the legions changes from being a force exclusively recruited from Roman citizens in the Italian peninsula to a force being recruited from Roman citizens or people who were being made Roman citizens, and increasingly from within the provinces themselves, particularly around the frontiers where citizen legionaries at the end of their service retired, settled there, and their children were there, so this was a good recruiting ground for the army. So you get quite a change taking place in the army. There's something that's notable when the Roman army's invasion of Britain takes place in AD 43. The legionary force that was arriving in Britain at that point was probably only about half of it of Italian extraction, if that. The other half was people who were Roman citizens, but they'd been born and brought up in Germany or Gaul or Spain or wherever. They were provincials. The other things that Augustus does, first of all, he formalises the nature of service, the duration of it, the terms and conditions under which soldiers served. But the principal changes from a short-term conscript army, the soldiers serving just for maximum normally of a few years at a time, to a long-term volunteer army of career soldiers, men who enrolled with the intention of spending effectively their entire adult life in the army. So it's a dramatic change. Manpower is the first thing that would concern any Roman emperor from Augustus onwards, is where do you get the recruits from? And we'll see in a moment they need a lot of recruits. They've got a big empire. The army is very large by any standard, right through until modern times. They quickly realised that the civil wars had revealed that there's a huge manpower pool in the provinces, that Civil War generals hadn't minded where they got their recruits from. So Augustus is willing to do the same thing. You have to exploit the manpower pool outside Italy as well. Partly to fill the ranks of the legions, but also to fill the ranks of a new force that's being created in parallel with the legions, the allied troops, the auxilia, that I'll come to in a moment. There'd been a change already in recruiting not just individuals into legions, but in recruiting entire legions in the provinces. Julius Caesar recruited one legion in Gaul. Pompey the Great at the same time in Spain had recruited 2 legions, one from Roman colonists who were established in Spain, but 2 from native Spaniards. So they were already recruiting entire legions from natives in the provinces. Augustus himself says that at the end of the Battle of Actium and the suicides of Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BC, he has sole control of the Roman Empire now, sole control of its forces. We know with the benefit of hindsight the civil wars were over. It wouldn't have been that obvious to people at the time. There'd been 100 years of upheaval and revolution and succession of civil wars, but the civil wars were over. He was able to start taking charge of the empire and reforming its army. He said that in 30 BC, the forces he had, his own army, plus those who'd now surrendered to him, who'd been part of Mark Antony's army, came to a total of 60 legions. Officially, that would be 300,000 men. There's 5,000 men per legion. In practice, they were probably all under strength, but it's still a huge force. Perhaps 200 to 250,000 men under arms, far more than he thought he needed at that point. Plus, there are tens of thousands of provincials who have been recruited into smaller regiments to serve alongside the legions, and are the armies of the various petty princes of the Roman Empire, rather like British India, with the petty rulers of British India who had their own armies that would serve alongside the British Imperial forces in time of war. The same is true of the Roman Empire. Most famously, Herod the Great in Judea regularly took his army off to serve alongside Roman emperors. So a massive overhaul is required. Augustus was to say in a document that he wrote himself, he wrote a document called the Achievements of the Divine Augustus, or that's what we call it, the Res Gestae Divi Augusti. It's a document that he seems to have started drawing up very early in his reign, but then he revised it as he continued. He was very sickly as a young man, and he was thought that he wasn't going to survive very long, so in the event he outlasted just about everybody. So he had to constantly keep updating this document that he'd written about his achievements. And in the document, one of the things that he says is that the number of Roman citizens who bound themselves to me by military oath was about 500,000. So he's saying that 500,000 Roman citizens took the oath of loyalty to him in the course of his lifetime. Of these, he says, I settled in colonies or sent back into their own towns after their term of service something more than 300,000. And to all I assigned lands or gave money as a reward for military service. So he's telling us briefly there the scale of what he does during his reign and how he dealt with these men at the end of the period of service, that he assigned them lands, he settled them in colonies, he sent them home if that's what they wanted, but they were to be rewarded for their long period of military service. So just to compare what Augustus does with what was there before, now leaving aside the civil wars, but in this period of the 100 years before Augustus, somewhere between 10 and 14 legions were in service every year during the period of the Republic. The soldiers were recruited from Roman citizens. There would be a small corps who were volunteers who had served as centurions perhaps in the past, and so when a new legion was being formed, they would volunteer to serve in it, to form the sort of core around which the rest of the legion would be created. But the mass of the soldiers in the Republican Legion were these short-term conscripts, most of whom were rather unwilling to be there. They knew it was one of their civic duties. Their principal civic duty was to serve when called upon. Their turn would come round, the list would be brought out to see whose turn it was to be enrolled. They never knew when they were being enrolled whether the campaign they were about to participate in was going to be nearby in Italy and would last just for the summer months, or whether they were going to be shipped off to Spain and might be away for a couple of years, or whether they were going to be ending up somewhere like Syria or Egypt and might not be back for 5 or 6 years. These are peasant soldiers. Their farms, while they're away, were simply left to their families, such as was possible. So increasingly unwillingness on the part of Roman citizens to serve because they were having to abandon their families, usually for long periods of time. It could be for up to 6 years in any one occasion, and up to a total of 16 years across their entire life. And of course, they might not come back. They might never return. So the army system of the late Republic was one that was socially and politically very disruptive and very much resented by Roman citizens, that they were being carted off again and again and again for these wars that seemed not to enrich them, but to enrich the aristocracy that was voting for them, or that was pushing for them. So the old arrangement of the Republic that Augustus inherits is inefficient. They've got to do something about it. It's also a dangerous way of running things. They've got a large empire now that it is at the time of the death of the Emperor Augustus. This dark brown and the light brown are the Roman provinces, but there's large areas that are yet to be brought into the Roman Empire. Thrace is not yet a province. All of eastern Turkey is not a province. Arabia around here is still to be created. Mauritania, and of course Britain. Romania, ancient Dacia, there was to become a province, and this whole area across here was to become a part of the Roman Empire as well. But it's still very large at the time of the death of Augustus. It requires careful organisation, a careful matching of needs to resources and to the types of troops you're going to need and where you're going to send them. There are still a lot of wars going on in the frontiers, and it's simply not efficient to have wars that are being fought by armies that are put together on an ad hoc basis. You're simply recruiting an additional couple of legions in Rome to send off the frontiers. You really need permanent forces actually on the frontiers to deal with the wars. So Augustus's objective is he has to try and match army size and the composition of the army to the needs of specific provincial garrisons and to the needs of warfare. It's rather a sort of modern concept. Ancient states didn't normally think in these terms. We take it for granted. It's an obvious, sensible thing to do, is to think about what your empire is like, where it is, what its needs are, and how you provide for that. In the ancient world, states normally didn't do that. What he has is an army that traditionally has consisted of heavy legionaries, heavy infantry, the legionary forces, the sort of thing that you see on the right here is a sort of classic image that turns up in books of what a Roman legionary soldier looked like in this core period of the Roman Empire. But he has to transform that into an army of long service, entirely volunteer soldiers. Alongside that, he decides that he's going to supplement these legions, that he's the professional army of legionaries, he's going to supplement them with, in parallel, an auxiliary force of soldiers recruited from the inhabitants of the provinces who are not Roman citizens and whom they're not prepared to enfranchise to enroll them in the legions. It enables them as well, thereby, alongside the heavy infantry of the legions, to have regiments of cavalry, light infantry, slingers, archers, and so on. And it also means that they can take advantage of the manpower pool of the provincials, and it takes the warlike element away from the provinces. It's not enough just to conquer some particular area and turn it into a province. If you then leave the manpower pool of that region with no particular outlet for its warlike energies, better to enroll them, just so that they will enroll recruits from Gaul and they'll send them to Syria. They'll recruit Syrians and send them to Egypt. Egyptians will be sent to Britain, and so on. They take these people into service, make use of them, but send them away from their homes. He also creates a permanent navy instead of the ad hoc force that had been used for centuries in the past. And he creates a permanent force of troops to be stationed in Rome, the Praetorian Guard and the Singulares that we'll come to. The army is structured and then equipped to meet the arms and the tactics of prospective enemies as well. They were aware that you needed a particular type of army to fight on the German frontier, for example, where the bulk of the enemy will fight on foot themselves. If you're fighting on the frontiers of Syria, you're fighting against enemies which have large cavalry armies and large armies of archers. So you need to structure the Roman army to meet these particular needs as well. That just summarises the sort of things I've just been talking about, with the change from the period of the Republic and the types of armies they had then to the changes that take place under Augustus. I don't think there's anything there I haven't already covered, so I'll quickly move on. The military bequest of Augustus. At the time of his death, the Roman historian Tacitus says that when the Emperor Tiberius, Augustus' successor, appears in the Senate for the first time, he has Augustus's will read out. And in the will, as Tacitus reports it, Tiberius gave instructions for a document to be produced and read. It was a list of the national resources. Again, something really quite remarkable for an ancient state, to actually have itemized their resources. It gave the number of regular and auxiliary troops serving in the army, the strength of the navy, statistics concerning the provinces and the dependent kingdoms, direct and indirect taxation, recurrent expenditure and gifts. Augustus had written all this out in his own hand. Furthermore, he'd added a clause advising that the empire should not be extended beyond its present frontiers. Either he feared dangers ahead or he was jealous. So it's a remarkable document that Tiberius has read out, in which Augustus, in his own hand it says, had itemized what the resources of the empire were, how many legions there were, where they were, the number of auxiliary troops, where the money came from, how they were paid. It's all set out there. Very modern. What he does in terms of changing the nature of service is that previously, as I've said, a soldier could serve for up to 6 years if they were conscripted and they were shipped off to somewhere distant from Italy. They could serve for up to 6 years at a time, and a total of 16 years over the course of their adult life. After 13 BC, Augustus, introducing reforms of the army at that point, he changes things so that in future the armies, the legions are to consist solely of volunteers. They have to serve for 16 years, followed by a further 4 in the reserve. Effectively, they're serving for 20 years. The 4 in the reserve simply meant that they wouldn't have to do some of the fatigues of the soldiers in their first 16 years. So his new army is one in which soldiers who enroll know that they're in the forces, in the army, for the next 20 years. After AD 6, they change things so that there isn't this period, especially in the reserve. They've simply got 20 years when they enroll, probably a further 5 in some sort of reserve, and soon after, we're not quite sure when, but soon after, they consolidate it at 25 years. When you enroll, you're in for 25 years, and that's the situation for essentially the next 300 years. So it's a very big change, not just that you're enrolling for 25 years, but that it's contrast with the 16 years maximum of the period of the Republic. So these are people who enter the forces when they're perhaps 17, 18, 19 years old, and they're in service if they survive through until their mid-40s. The terms of service, they're all to be paid. Pay had been introduced in the late Republic, but it was not systematized in any way. But Augustus establishes an annual salary of 900 sesterces to be paid in 3 installments. You got your pay every 4 months. Just to put it in context, to be a senator, you needed to have a property qualification of 1 million sesterces. So a soldier getting 900 a year is, we think in terms of there being some inequality in income today, but this is rather serious inequality. A serving legionary would be regarded as somebody who was relatively well off, being paid 900 sesterces, but a senator would have at least 1 million sesterces he needed. They didn't get the 900. They had deductions made for their equipment, for their messing, for the food that they were being provided with, and some of the salary was saved compulsorily for them. It was held back to be given to them when they finally retired. When they did retire, they were given all these accumulated savings, plus the state gave them a gratuity equivalent to 14 years' pay. A huge sum of money. You're not only getting all your accumulated savings, your equivalent to superannuation, I suppose, but you're now being given the equivalent of 14 years' pay on top of that as you move into retirement. And then on top of that, they were given tax and legal privileges that would set them aside wherever they settled down. They would stand out in the community as people who were relatively wealthy, and they had these tax and legal privileges as well. Augustus himself undertook the responsibility for arranging for their pay and for paying the gratuities when they retired. He establishes a military treasury, and it works out means of getting money into that treasury from a 5% tax on inheritances and a 5% tax on the sale of slaves. And then from time to time he tells us that he personally, from his own immense wealth, subsidized the military treasury. The objective, of course, was to attract volunteers. He needs a lot of men to volunteer. He doesn't want to press Roman citizens into service anymore. That's too disruptive. They're unwilling. He wants to attract people who are volunteering and are attracted by the terms and conditions of service. He also wants them to be loyal to him, so he wants them to be aware that their pay, their gratuity, comes from a military treasury set up by him. The oath of loyalty is taken to him, not to the state. And he wants the army to be focused on the fact that they are professional soldiers, so that soldiers were forbidden to marry, and they managed to maintain that position for 200 years. I'll come back to that a little later. It means that he creates an army that's much more stable than anything gone before. He's eliminated the things that were unpopular about regular conscription and being taken away from home, and he provides for the attractions of service to be things that will draw enough recruits into the army every year so that nobody has to be pressed into service. So he gets rid of the disruption that had taken place for the previous 100 years in particular. What he actually creates is 28 legions. As we saw, he has 60 when the Civil Wars ended. He gradually boils that down to 28 that he keeps in service, each officially about 5,000 strong, so it's the equivalent of a modern division, I suppose. So you've got 140,000 citizen soldiers in these 28 legions. There's a disaster in AD 9 in which 3 entire legions are destroyed, and he never replaces them, probably because it would have been too difficult to get all those extra recruits at one hit, in addition to the normal recruits you need simply to fill gaps. Suddenly, he has the need for an additional 15,000 to replace these 3 legions, so he never replaces them. So when he dies in AD 14, the legionary force is 25 legions, about 125,000 men. That's much higher. That's twice the number of legions that was normally in service during the Republic, whereas I mentioned a moment ago, it's been about 12 and 16 legions per year in service. He now formalises it as 25 to 28 permanently available. Even that was probably rather demanding on getting enough volunteers. That's probably why he continually increases the length of service, the initial 12 plus 4, and then making that 16 plus 4, and so on. Eventually, until he got 25, it means that he's keeping men in service much longer, and it's probably because it was so difficult to get enough volunteers. He's able to make use of the spread of Roman citizenship outside Italy, not least through the settlement of legionaries in the provinces who decide not to go back home at the end of the period of service. Previously, with short-term service overseas, a man who'd served in Spain for a couple of years or even in Syria for 6 years, at the end of his service, he wanted to go back to Italy. So these forces would be returned to Italy, and if they were being paid off in some way, they might be settled there. Now, with legions that are stationed in distant provinces up on the Rhine or along the Danube or on the Euphrates in Syria or in Egypt, after 25 years service, if you've enrolled when you're 17 or 18 years old, your entire adult life has been spent in the army in a province. They're not allowed to officially marry, but Roman soldiers have wives and children. They don't want to go home. They're not interested in returning home at the end of the service, so they simply settle where they've spent their entire career in the province, perhaps even in the same place just outside where they've been stationed for the previous near generation. Their children can then be enrolled in the army so that the state is able to start recruiting extensively from the provinces, from the sons of legionaries. Colonies are established around the frontiers as well to settle these soldiers in, so that when you get groups of soldiers being discharged at the same time from the army along the Rhine, instead of offering them the chance to go back to Italy, you'll offer them the chance to settle in a new colony, land that's been confiscated from the native tribes and is now being given to the retired soldiers. So modern Cologne is one of those. It was Colonia Agrippinensis. Beirut in the Lebanon was Colonia Julia Felix Berytus. There are a whole string of these colonies established all around the Roman Empire for settling discharged legionaries. In the period of Augustus, this is the sort of equipment a Roman legionary would have worn: chain mail, a brass helmet. Centurions, rather more ornate equipment. They wouldn't have gone into battle wearing their medals. Roman soldiers were given medals, and they might have worn the crest, because the idea of a crest was to make you look much taller, rather like the busbies of the soldiers in the British Army and so on. The forces in Italy having looked at the legions in the provinces. The forces in Italy, the Praetorian Guard is established by Augustus. Traditionally it's his bodyguard. It consists of Roman citizens, probably about 9,000 men in 9 cohorts. Nobody's been quite sure why the odd number of 9 was selected. Alongside them are the urban cohorts. It's a paramilitary police force. Rome is a big city. It's the biggest city of the ancient world. Its population running towards about 1 million people at this point. Law and order had been a problem in the late Republic. The urban cohorts now provide a sort of paramilitary police force. Not quite sure how many there were. We know there were 3 cohorts, but we don't know what size each cohort was, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 probably. Then there's a paramilitary fire brigade. Rome was subject to fires. The vigiles could be called upon to perform military service as well, since they are a sort of paramilitary force. There's probably about 3,500 of them. Then the emperor has his mounted bodyguard, normally recruited from Germans or from Batavians. We think probably about 1,000 strong. And then in Italy as well, he's created 2 fleet bases, 2 permanent fleets, one at Ravenna near Venice, and the other at Misenum on the Bay of Naples. The fleets are manned now by freedmen, people who'd been slaves but had been freed. And in the Roman system, you have this curious situation that you went from being a slave. If you were then freed by a Roman citizen owner, you became a citizen as well. So you'd go from the lowest status to the highest status. Freedmen could serve in the fleets and you'd be paid as servicemen. But the biggest change probably is the Exilia. This is the recruitment of provincial soldiers, making use of the manpower of the Gauls, the Spaniards, the Syrians, the Egyptians, and so on. The 150,000 men in the legions simply wasn't enough. That might seem like a huge force, and it was twice the number of legions that had been around in the Republican period in any given year. But Augustus decided this wasn't enough, so he exploits this huge manpower pool in the provinces. They're not formed into anything comparable to legions. There's no block of auxiliaries of 5,000 as with the legion. Instead, they're put into smaller regiments of about 500. There are some that are 1,000 strong, but most of them are about 500. So you get infantry regiments called a cohort. Some would be heavy infantry. It depended really on what the provincial subject people how they traditionally fought. The Roman state makes use of whatever the local talent in warfare was. So if the local Gauls were traditionally famous for their horsemanship, then they would be enrolled in regiments of cavalry. The people of the Balearic Islands and of Crete were famous as slingers and archers, so they would be formed into regiments of slingers and archers and so on. We don't know how many of these there were, but in the time of Augustus it's thought that they probably totaled about 125,000, so roughly the same number as the number of men in the legions. And they frequently now start to appear in Roman art, on tombstones and on public monuments. Well, this is Moorish cavalry. You can see that they're light cavalry. They're wearing no heavy equipment. They've got their shields, and probably originally there had been a brass spear in their hand. That's long since disappeared from the monument. The numbers of exilia grew quite dramatically during the period of the empire after Augustus, because it's a large manpower pool. It's easier to tap that manpower pool than to find more men for the legions or to increase the number of legions. They're cheaper. They were paid only in half the rate of legionaries, and they weren't given a gratuity when they retired. Instead, they were given Roman citizenship, which cost the state nothing, and simply meant that their children would be then eligible to serve in the legions. They're also much more flexible than the heavy infantry of the legions. You've got regiments now of all kinds. You're from heavy cavalry through to slingers and archers at the other extreme. The illustration on the left is taken from illustrations on Roman monuments, which are sometimes difficult to see on the monument what exactly you're looking at, but 3 types of auxiliary soldier are shown here: a Syrian archer, and a regiment that ended up in the suburbs of Glasgow, for its sins. A man here is a slinger. This is slinging the stone he's about to fire, or the bullet he's about to fire. We shouldn't underestimate these. Their range was twice that of an archer, and they could be absolutely lethal in the hands of skilled slingers. So that's the sort of people you wanted out in front of the army before the 2 armies clashed. You'd have these people firing these bullets off with considerable force. And sometimes they were cast from lead, and they'd sometimes put little messages on them, like, take that. The horsemen of the Exilia, again wearing just a sort of chainmail and having a spear and a long sword. The long sword because from horseback you need to be able to slash the greater distance. An infantryman with a shorter sword, but equipped in much the same way as a legionary was. So quite a variety in what auxiliary soldiers were equipped with. And rather oddly from our perspective, the cavalry had these strange masks that they wore as well. We're not entirely sure when they wore them, certainly when they were simply parading, I suppose a bit like the horse guards in Britain on ceremonial days. They wear the sort of equipment that they wouldn't wear if they were going into battle. But they may have worn them sometimes in battle simply because it makes them look so, well, rather frightening, but probably rather spoil your vision as well. It's hard enough having a helmet on where the helmet prevents you hearing what's going on. If you can't see as well, that's a bit of a problem. I'll pause in about 5 minutes, by which time the urn outside should have heated up nicely. The Navy establishes, as we saw, a fleet at Ravenna and at Misenum, but then later emperors established other fleet bases around the Mediterranean, at Frejus on the south coast of France, Alexandria in Egypt, Seleucia near Antioch in Syria, a fleet on the Black Sea, one on the Danube, one on the Rhine, and then there was the Classis Britannica, the fleet on the English Channel after their conquest of Britain. The sailors recruited from freedmen, not from actual slaves, but from former slaves. And one of the striking things is that after the establishment of the permanent Roman Navy, you almost never hear of piracy anywhere in the Mediterranean for the next 300 years. It had been a constant feature of the centuries before that, but it's virtually eliminated. Again, something that's quite unusual right through until, if you read the history of the Mediterranean in the 19th century, piracy was still rife. Then there's the armies of the allied rulers, the princelings of the Roman Empire, people like Herod the Great I'd mentioned before. They make use of these armies in time of war. They also recruited mercenaries from beyond the frontier, so we get this rather unusual tombstone here to a cavalryman, and then there's a man with a bow in his hands there. And you won't be able to read it probably, but it tells you that the regiment's called the Cohors Parthorum et Araborum. In other words, it's recruited from Parthians, the empire to the east of Rome, and roughly what's modern Iraq and Iran, and from Arabs. They're recruiting mercenaries from beyond the frontiers. As an example of how allied rulers could make a significant contribution, this is at the time of the first Jewish war in the middle of the 1st century AD. The Jewish writer Josephus tells us that the various Arab kings, I won't read it all there, but he tells us about their specific contributions. And you can see that the total Roman army of 60,000, 15,000 of that consisted of men provided by these petty princes, largely cavalry and archers. So at the time of the death of the Emperor Augustus, if you tot it all up, there's 25 legions after 3 of them have been destroyed in the Varian disaster. There's the Exilia, the fleets, the regiments in Rome, and then there's the troops that were available in the states of the petty rulers, a total of about 300,000 men. You've got to go through to the Louis XVI in France to find an army on that sort of scale again in modern times. It was a huge force, and that wasn't the end of it. It was to be enlarged dramatically over the next 200 years as well. It's thought that, according to one modern estimate, that about half of all imperial expenditure may have gone to provide for the army. Not surprisingly, the state frequently struck coins that had military images on them. It wanted the soldiers to know that they were prized, we've actually put you on our coins, and it wanted the wider civilian population as well to be constantly reminded of the role of the army. So you get things like this, a coin in which the emperor is there up in his tribunal, and he's addressing a group of 3 soldiers to represent an army, and it tells you that it's the fides exercitus, the fidelity of the army, the emperor commending them for their good faith, their loyalty to him, and he's addressing them. In addition to the gratuity they got at the end of the period of service, which they would know came from the emperor's treasury, in the course of his reign, on particular occasions, he would give them a bonus, an imperial marriage. He'd been reigning for 20 years, time to give them another bonus. So the army was constantly provided for by the emperors. Then there's the junior officers and the officers who make the whole thing function properly. I won't go through those, but we're all familiar with the centurions of the Roman army, 60 in an individual legion. The auxiliary regiments also have their centurions, and these people were the backbone of the army. You could rise up through the ranks to become a centurion, and then as a centurion you could rise up through the various levels of the centurionate. The highest levels for a centurion was the first centurion in a legion, very experienced, and he would be then given the status of an equestrian, a junior aristocrat, which meant that he also had wealth equivalent to 400,000 sesterces. So a legionary is getting 900 sesterces a year. Once you become the first centurion of a legion, your wealth is dramatically increased. You become a person of some considerable significance, not just militarily, but socially as well. I'll pause at that because I'm sure that the tea is ready and you're probably all ready for it, but we'll carry on with looking at various themes relating to the Roman army when we come back in.